We are gathered on the traditional territories of... No, let's try this another way. The Two-Row Wampum 1613 is the first example of a nation-to-nation treaty of respect and non-interference between Indigenous and European nations, namely the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch, who were to travel down the river of life together, but stay in their own respective canoes with their own languages, customs, and laws, for as long as the grass grows green, for as long as the wind blows, and for as long as the sun shines. Law Association Initiative 2019. Now, inside a place known as Museum London, so named perhaps to house an obsolescence, and which I humbly but earnestly suggest is neither a museum nor situated in London, exactly that name having remained on the other side of the ocean east of us, despite its colonizers' westward departure. I am gratefully situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenni Lenape, and Huron-Wendat peoples. The first in continuous nations closest in proximity to me, the Southwest, are the Oneida Nation of the Thames, the Munsee Delaware Nation, and the Chippewa of the Thames First Nation. I would also like to acknowledge the trickle of sweat running cold down the nape of WordsFest artistic director Josh Lambier, to whom, along with the many volunteers in this room that I am happy to share even now, I am deeply grateful for the opportunity to speak with Tom Cull, author of Bad Animals, published by Insomniac Press. Karen Houle, author of The Grand River Watershed, a folk ecology, published by Gaspereau Press, and David Huebert, author of Humanimus, published by Palimpsest Press. And most importantly, welcome to you, our online audience, for this panel, The Poetics of Ecology. To begin a panel so titled, with oikos from the Greek meaning home or house, let's just sit in that land acknowledgement for a moment. Considering the Two-Row Wampum, a treaty, one might say, 4-century-old unfulfilled promise to journey in parallel down the river of life, I wonder whether, Karen, you've written an astonishing book through and about the complexities of a phenomenon like the Grand River. Tom, your relationship with the Deshkan Ziibiing is always ongoing, and David, like so many of us, you're situated on a sinking peninsula. I wonder, before we bring poetry into this conversation, whether we could talk as settlers about our respective relationships to the home bodies of water, to place, and to our roles as poets in these places. And thank you.
Good.
Karen, I wonder whether you would offer the distinction between space and place that I've heard from you before.
Well, I guess one way that we could parse those two words is, I think of space as something quite connected to a Cartesian worldview. There's a grid upon which say the Canadian and the Ontario land surveyors work. We see the grids in our cities. It's grids in the prairies. It's a kind of a bunch of squares laid upon the surface of the earth that we can use for very, very specific coordinates that all of us can orient to. So 32 degrees north, 56 degrees west. That would be an example of something that I think is a metric of space. Useful, important. We couldn't do a lot without those. I like when we get lost and we get them wrong. But so that's one way of orienting ourselves to where we are, is to have some metrics that we share and that are sort of like fairly universalizable, true north, for instance. But then when I think about place, it feels to me like the concept of place is maybe like an invitation or a challenge to each of us to discover something different about where we are, where we travel, what our sort of territorial habits look like, So more fluid, more about how we're actually moving, where our imaginaries go. And I think it's a sort of a weaving of a sense of inhabitation, if we're lucky, with a particular geographical, a geography that's tied to fungi, that's tied to trees, that's tied to the smell of the air, that's tied to the weathers in our particular daily lives, which are going to be super singular. So might not be shared, but still have to do with I think a kind of responsibility to inhabit where we happen to find ourselves in a way that pays tribute to what it is, rather than sort of tell it what it is and what we need it to be. So those are just some senses. Thank you for the question.
I wonder if you'd say a word, Tom or David, about the bodies of water that have been significant to you throughout your lives and which you identify perhaps as home bodies of water as we start to situate ourselves in this conversation about the poetics of ecology.
So I grew up near Goderich, Ontario, Treaty 29 territory, and I grew up on the Minnesotong River, which was later named the Maitland River. I had about 100 acres of pretty pristine forest and ponds and rivers, and that became a kind of blueprint for when I moved to new spaces. Of course, I grew up also not knowing the pre-colonial history of that territory that I was on. And so now, my orientation to that nostalgia has necessarily been shifted. And I guess that's some of what I'm trying to think through in my work, is that how do I, what's the internal reconciliation of a kind of growing up, of a kind of home, of a kind of identity that now has been, like I said, necessarily shifted because, the 10,000 years of human history before the 300 years that I learned about is now coming more firmly into view. And of course, the huge political ramifications of that when we think about reconciliation, land back, all those necessary conversations that we're having and necessary political movement. So, I guess that's also part of the blueprint that I bring to Deshkan Ziibiing, or the work that I do, and the environmental work that that we do, which I've started saying. I keep reminding myself I don't want to say environmental work, but environmental justice work, because that includes the history of this place, the treaties, understanding the treaties, and one of the things that, Kevin, you asked us to sit in a moment with a land acknowledgement. And I've been going to a bunch of talks this week about Treaty Recognition Week. And one thing that, I've been thinking about is Sarah May Chitty, who works at University of Western and Indigenous Services, was saying that we often acknowledge territory, but we don't kind of acknowledge the land itself and the kind of animals and the plants and the minerals. And especially when I say we, I mean when settlers do land acknowledgements. And that's a stark difference from when, Indigenous land acknowledgements that kind of acknowledge those relationships. So I would just say that some of the work here is just about building relationships, not only with the histories, but also with the animals and the plants and the rocks, the curves in the river, and the grass, everything, and thinking about those relationships, as Karen just articulated, in terms of space, in terms of those unique individual relationships.
As Karen writes in the acknowledgement section of her excellent The Grand River Watershed of Folk Ecology, the original and ongoing inhabitants, fish, fur, feather, and two-leggeds. David, I wonder if you'd say a few words about your experience as a settler, still inhabiting as we are this question of the land acknowledgement, this ongoing question, acknowledging both the land and its inhabitants.
Sure.
Moving from Halifax to London and back, recognizing that both of those cities are, of course, imposed colonial terms. What has that transition like been for you, and what does it mean for you to be on a peninsula, which as the title of your short story collection suggests, is, as much of the coast in the world right now is sinking.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, that's lovely. Can I get a, so there's this issue of sound happening in the chat, by the way.
Okay.
I don't know if you're looking at that, Kevin, but I wonder if folks can hear me. And yeah, so I wonder if there's anything we can do about this. I think people are continuing to have a problem with sound.
I'm looking at my tech folks here.
Yeah. Okay, we fixed it from words moderator. Okay, sounds good. Okay, so thanks for this really important question. And yeah, so these are really great responses from Karen and Tom as well. Yeah, moving from, so I'm here in Mi'kma'ki. This is the territory of the Mi'kmaq. I grew up in this place. And so part of my own history, similar to Tom, is a history of growing up in this place and, you know, the embarrassment of growing up in this place where these, you know, settler colonial encounters are the oldest really in the country, and not being educated about that really. And so my own embarrassment about that, my embarrassment with the systems that would allow that to happen, my coming to know about my gradual, you know, slow, stunted, half-assed, inadequate awakening about these histories, and yeah, my attempt to do better and my attempt to learn, my attempt to open up to these histories. A lot of that's happened coming back to Mi'kma'ki. This time I moved back here a little over a year ago, and yeah. I had, you know, hung out in London with people like Tom and people who were taking issues of settler colonialism more seriously than most people that I knew in Halifax had been. And since I've been back here, I feel that that's in the proverbial air here as well now, more than it was before. So yeah, I just continue to try to learn and think and be educated and acknowledge. And this question of acknowledging the land is really fascinating to me. It's something I do talk about when on the odd occasion when I've had opportunities to talk about students, to talk with students about questions of ecology. I always do a sort of extensive land acknowledgement that, as yours did, Kevin, attempts to push beyond the rote, tokenistic, blanket statement that's usually read by settlers as a sort of peripheral far gesture towards what's really an inadequate engagement. And I asked them to think about acknowledging the land, what the word acknowledgement means to people. What does the word acknowledgement mean to you? I think is worth thinking about. What the land acknowledgement very rarely does is acknowledge the land. Right? Think about and direct the knowing mind towards the land. Right. And that's sort of what we're being asked to do. And that's what, and part of the reason we're being asked to do that is because, like, you know, I don't want to make a blanket statement, but I know, for example, Anishinaabe worldview sees the land, you know, for the most part, most people would say, I think, sees the land as much more animate than the Western epistemology, right? And same with Mi'kmaq worldview, right? So this idea, so we're being asked to sort of enter that mindset, to me, when we think about what it means to acknowledge the land. And I take the word acknowledgement very seriously as a sort of philosophical concept, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I think it's very important for all of us to continue the work of acknowledging the land and acknowledging what it means to be on this land. And all the complexities of that. And yes, for me, this was a question of relationship to bodies of water as well. Growing up, I have the same nostalgia as Tom. My nostalgia is directed towards the North Atlantic Ocean. I would be remiss here if I didn't mention lobsters, right? Lobsters, which are the site of enormous racialized tension right now in Mi'kma'ki. Lobsters, which are contested. Lobsters, which vehicles of Mi'kmaq fishermen are being burned in relation to. And so, yeah, my memory is a nostalgia for lobsters, among other things. I used to go to PEI in the summers, and I remember swimming over these really thick weeds that probably don't exist anymore. And we called them the lobster weeds. And there was a great thrill and terror in swimming over those weeds. And because I would imagine that the lobster claws were coming up to like nip at my, you know, delicate breast flesh, right? And I remember having lobsters in the bathtub. And I don't know if anyone else had lobsters in the bathtub as a kid, but what could be creepier than walking into the bathroom to use that bathroom and finding a bathtub full of lobsters? So that's just one entry point in my mental window into nostalgia for the North Atlantic Ocean. And I hope I've given some context about how that nostalgia has been complicated as well in my thinking.
Tremendous, David. Now, to address the work, Karen, deep congratulations and gratitude for, with Gasborough Press, bringing this extraordinary collection into the world. You begin the collection with a line from Aristotle: the difference between the historian and the poet consists really in this, that the one describes the thing that has been and the other a kind of thing that might be. The book braids history and poetry, as do Tom's and David's books, also spectacular, and due deep congratulations and gratitude. Yet throughout, I'm thinking particularly of was thick with pine and hardwood forests and fish and game, or what is to be had. You expose the insufficiency of anthropocentric, Aristotelian, hierarchic categorization and the ludicrousy of property ownership, turning the tools of Western philosophy and politics upon themselves to reveal their inadequacy to describe sustainable lived experience. To begin discussion of the work then, Karen, I wonder whether you, as a professor of philosophy at Guelph University, who's just written an astonishing folk ecology in ongoing dialogue by way of the poem's epigraphs with Merleau-Ponty and Levinas and Wittgenstein and Deleuze, I wonder whether you would say a few words about what might be the insufficiency of Western philosophy and the nounal ownership-oriented language we're communicating in now to describe experience, and how that led you to the grand river, the oldest, most dependable, and wisest companion of all, as you write in the acknowledgement section. Karen, you're muted.
Oh, there I am.
No longer.
Okay. What a beautiful question. I think my answer, any answer I can come up with, Kevin, will not match the loveliness of that question that you just put out there. So let me try, though, since you asked. Thanks for the gift of a prompt. I have a funny sense of friendship, I think. And when I read the texts, when I was studying the texts of Aristotle or Wittgenstein or Foucault, Deleuze, Guattari, Levinas, I read them in all sorts of ways. I read them preparing for lectures and to try to help other people understand what I thought was being taught there. But I also read them the way I used to read books when I was a kid, like with sort of wild affection and curiosity for who these beings were, and these characters, and these, in the philosophy text, the characters are concepts that are dancing around and making merry and sometimes being a bit rascally. So if you've heard some philosophers in my work, I've sort of cherry-picked particular lines that felt like absolutely overflowing with joy and possibility, and that had this sort of tenacity and sensitivity that felt like it belonged to like the world of walking and the world of dancing and the world of poetry. I mean, it can belong in the world of philosophy, which has its own ways, but philosophy can often be railroaded entirely by logic and analysis until you end up with like nothing. You've analyzed something until you have like nothing. You've just got a handful of nothing. And it doesn't feel to me as though literature and art and poetry and walking on the territory in a certain way brings us to that to that telos. At the end, we don't have nothingness. We have like kind of almost too muchness. So I hope that I haven't been too didactic in saying that Western philosophy and the thinkers that thought within that canon or on the edge of that canonical world brought nothing to us. I wanted to say there's all these interesting wormholes from one idiom into another. And so there are like incredible, valuable moves and actions and possibilities that are within what we call the Western philosophical tradition. It's not, I think I'd be just a terrible hypocrite to say that it's all full of stupidity and needs to be left behind and entirely overturned. I was more interested in finding those, what we call like minor chords that maybe hadn't been explored enough on hands and knees with a headlamp to feel out what it was that was actually being, what the provocativeness of those lines. So I tried to just share with the readers, not by way of being like erudite or condescending and here's philosophy. It's like, no, these lines, they're so blasting, full of beauty and confusion. And why I loved mostly those philosophers is I don't think that any of those guys were hell-bent on finding the final answer. And I found the beauty of like Wittgenstein completely writing another text that sort of undid what he'd done at Oxford 30 years prior. I find that sort of so humbling and so beautiful. And a sort of minor tradition within philosophy is to say, we're moving toward too muchness and confusion. And isn't that, can't we harness the power of that in maybe another domain, in philosophy or in, I don't know, composting, that that can do more, that can do different kind of work.
Tom, I wonder whether you would say a few words about the way the river you know and love, the Deshkan Ziibiing or Antler River, or the Thames River as it's known to many, functions as a kind of polyvocal, many-named conveyance, and with great respect to your work as the co-founder with Miriam and Emmett of the Antler River Rally, a repository or container of stories, often stories we refuse.
Yeah, happy. Kevin, I don't know if you saw in the chat, but David just posted that he had a follow-up to Karen's point.
Please.
And I wondered whether, David, you want to jump in there before I...
Yeah, just very briefly. Yeah, because I've been reading Aristotle lately too, and I've been reading some ancient Greek writing, and I just wanted to add, sort of just seconding, or maybe it would be to build on what Karen's saying. I think it does a disservice to this whole conversation if we oversimplify the Western tradition, right? Because the Western tradition can be, the Western scientific tradition can be a scapegoat or a straw target for
the Western juridical legal system. I mean, some of the most interesting for me and productive moments are looking back at the alignment in the Haudenosaunee juridico-political systems and the political systems that were coming from a different tradition, and how those were intended to be sort of mutually supportive and respectful and lining up. As we see, like the two-row wampum is not just about the rivers and canoeing, it's also about ideas that could actually travel side by side. And some concepts in the Western legal tradition will find their way helpfully into Indigenous legal traditions and vice versa. Not all, but I mean, there are gifts there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would just wanted to add, and I thank you for that. Yeah, that's brilliant as well. Yeah, I just want to say a lot of this has to do with the question of interpretation and how we interpret, and what I think, and how the Western tradition has been interpreted and sort of then sold and repackaged and marketed. So a lot of this has to do with the demand for more capacious imaginings and interpretations of what that tradition sort of had to say all along, right? Because it's partly about how that tradition gets mobilized, right? Yeah, so that's all I really had to say.
Tom?
Kevin, I've kind of, your question now is a bit fuzzy now to me.
Oh, please.
Because I was listening intently, but I'll just kind of jump in. So yeah, about the river work and I moved to London about 12 years ago. And I met Miriam and Emmett at that time. He was, I think, 1.5, almost 2. And we came together walking along the river and spending our time on the river. And that's how our family kind of developed and still evolves. And we just, I was writing poetry at that time and thinking about what it meant to write nature poetry, and also thinking about like, what is nature poetry? And, you know, L. Jones has that great statement about how, you know, nature poets never talk about land, they talk about nature, kind of reproducing a terra nullius, or a kind of doctrine of discovery logic in their poetry, where you go out and kind of discover something, claim it in a certain kind of way without understanding deeper relations or history or the, you know, the politics that allows that privilege of viewing the world in that way. And so I really, you know, that also flowed together with kind of my ideas around this river that I was seeing all this trash in, and wanting to get to know my city and wanting to get to know the place that we were kind of building together. And so we started this little cleanup group where we met, and we've been doing this 9 years now, every third Saturday or more, to do just cleanups of the river, and to, you know, work with overlapping kind of social and environmental issues as they kind of coalesce around the river. A river does flow through all of my work and my thinking, and I can't separate that kind of river from my poetry and from my teaching as well. Those things all, they flow together, and the more they do, the more I find all of it more productive and more meaningful. You know, before I was talking about kind of like looking at disrupting easy nostalgia. And one thing I wanted to add to that is that, you know, disruption of that easy nostalgia is sometimes maybe kind of challenging work, but it's a great gift. And there's joy and real meaning in that gift of kind of rediscovering. I mean, I think of myself as a historian, and so finding these histories that I know nothing about is also a great, you know, joy to me. And you know, it's also, to come back to family, a way that we've kind of found something that gives us meaning. We don't go to church on Sundays, you know, but we do go to the river on Saturdays. And so that's part of how we imagine, you know, ourself in this space, and how I imagine also what it means to kind of try to think about and teach and talk about what nature is and how to write about it.
Beautiful. Tom, you have a poem for us, Treaty 45.5.
There's a long footnote that goes with this poem, but I'm not going to read it. I'm going to, Aamjiwnaang historian David D. Plain wrote this book called A Brief History of the Saugeen Peninsula, which I read. I went to a treaty workshop, that's where I first met David, at Aamjiwnaang, given by Monica Virtue and David. Then he was so nice to give me this book, because it covers some of the territory in which I grew up, and I had the opportunity of spending some time at Point Clark this summer, and sat on this beach while I was reading this book about how this Treaty 45, you know, how that came into being, and how the Crown basically stole land through deception and coercion, you know, basically by promising that, you know, you give us this land and we'll give you the whole Saugeen Peninsula. You know, we can't protect you because the settlers are moving in and there's nothing we can do, so why don't you, you know. And then of course, as soon as that treaty was signed, the Crown then went after the whole peninsula. And so those treaties are, you know, before the courts right now. So this is called Treaty 45. Sorry, Treaty 45.5 is the actual treaty number. Contend with 10,000 years, the lake once so low, a land bridge stretched from here to Albany. Boulders drowned by rising waters mark places paleo hunters corralled caribou, crossed from the north, stepped onto this beach, and through loops of time and relation forward. Now the beach is waterlogged to nearly gone. A red balloon snarls in the roots of a tree fallen into the surf. Waves paint dull stones, churn froth, broken shells, cigarette butts. I find a green plastic figure, headdress, bare-chested, moccasins, expressionless, made in China. And another handful of sand, an empty cap gun cartridge, the kind we bought as kids, flashing badge, quick draw, we laid down the law and reloaded. Killed each other before lunch in a clap of sulfur and smoke. The shored ruins of growing up, crop tours, mineral moonlight, smelt runs, beach sturgeon, July bonfires burned our school notes, other histories and geographies, ours, the bored drone of Upper and Lower Canada, Wolfe and Montcalm lulled us into daily disremembering, sitting high in a tractor cab, blasting country, hydraulics and steel turning over the soil below. When headlines hit, Oka, Ipperwash, we gathered up the silence we had planted and stuffed our ears with seeds. Each spring, frost churned up stones we loaded onto wagons and dumped in the swamp. Somewhere thousands of feet under this lake, massive machines claw at walls of salt. No end to what we'll dig up, what we'll try to bury. The land breaks through the map of it. It's all here, caught between the call and response of sandbar and dune. I want to wait here until the sturgeon return, smelt, run, plovers brood, until I am blasted into beach glass. I leave, step through a wood lit rich pink by the setting sun, the path, a wreckage of giant ash, felled to halt, emerald ash borer. Logs are stripped, the larvae have eaten ornate ring roads, looped back on themselves, a topography of progress pressed into my palm. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. I mean, at this point, to be more attentive to the questions that are going to be coming through the chat. What's the name of the author's book, Tom? David?
D. Plain, P-L-A-I-N.
There was a question, I think this was meant for you, Tom. Can't we go to the river and church?
We sure can.
There you go. And speaking of a topography in progress, David, before Humanimus with Palimpsest, you published with Biblioasis, Peninsula Sinking, a sequence of short stories, the last of which is titled Horse People, which is where we encounter water levels drowning Halifax, New York, all coastal cities, regarding which story one reviewer wrote, your inspiring and heartening ability to find the humor even among the wreckage of lives was in full swing. One of the ways humor functions in Humanimus is by means of the full mondegreen, a phoneme by phoneme mishearing of song lyrics, as in the book's note section, the girl with colitis goes by, or the girl with kaleidoscope eyes. It seems to me to function like the beauty we find there in that book, with an intensity equivalent to the toxicity of the environments you describe. Regarding Humanimus, Margaret Christakos writes that, quote, poetic forms that favor repetition and transmutation of word and line structure act as sturdy racks for these sensational forays into the wild in us. I wonder whether you would offer a few words about the forms in Humanimus as means of foray into the wild in us, and the habits of mind poetry is well positioned to play with and subvert.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm also pretty wowed by your question. I'm glad that you quoted from Margaret's blurb, because it's better than anything in the book. so thanks a lot. I was wondering I thought, Kevin, that you mentioned something about putting the poems in the chat. I was wondering if Tom could put his poem in the chat, just because when he was reading it aloud, I was reading along with it, and I was sort of sad that that the attendees can't read along with it as well. So I don't know, just a side note before I answer your lovely question. Forms in Humanimus. Yeah, it takes on a lot of formal experiments. That's one of the things that sort of drove me through the experience, and one thing that allowed me to sort of approach to sort of concretize the book and approach this subject matter without being repetitive in a way. So it allowed me to to approach the similar veins of thinking, which is about humans, animals, animus, ecology, compromised ecology, what Tom Cull and I, who by the way are friends and collaborators, have been calling dirty nature writing in some of our other writing, which would be perhaps something worth discussing as well. Yeah, so it allowed me to approach it allowed me to find fresh ways to approach, to reinvigorate my thinking, I guess. So yeah, there's a lot of different forms. The mondegreen, and I owe huge thanks to Andy Verboom. You mentioned the mondegreen. It was really Andy that came up with the mondegreen, and I sort of just really liked playing with it. And so Andy let me, and he let me be part of his chapbook project, Full Mondegreens, which ended up being a collaborative project in which we, and the only poem that we did together was a full mondegreen, and I'll explain briefly what that means, but of In Flanders Fields. So it's very apropos right now, and it was one of the most fun ones to write. But yeah, as you mentioned, the mondegreen is a purposeful mishearing, and sort of, and this can be really fun to do, as you spoke of with the girl from Colitis Goes By, the girl with colitis goes by, excuse me, for the girl with kaleidoscope eyes. It can be really fun. Speaking of like sort of place and mapping, some of the mapping conversation, space and place and mapping, this is a sort of sonic mapping project. And it's a very playful, it's a very purposeful form of play. I'm glad to hear you also say that, that you found the book, that you think there's humor in the book. Because reading through, thinking about this book, I think of it as quite a serious, heavy book. And I'm glad that, and I think you're right, that the mondegreens help it break through the dour, which is very important to me in terms of this conversation, the larger conversation about the role of the comic in art these days, questions of use value of art. If we're talking about poetics of ecology, right? I heard my colleague Hamza Karam Ali give a very convincing account of the reason why he values art and poetry and literature in particular is because of its uselessness, right? And that's not, he's not the first person to have said that, but it's something I've been thinking about. And so if we're thinking about the poetics of ecology, how can we claim that this, he was basically saying, and what's convincing to me is the value is in uselessness. The value is in uselessness, right? Which seems paradoxical, but I think most of us can resonate with, right? Yeah, I guess the mondegreens certainly allow for an escape, even though many of them end up circling around similar themes and themes that are on my mind. The constraint of the form allows a freedom from the potential pitfalls of environmental writing, I guess is what I would say, which is something that I'm very interested in more generally, which is sort of the limitations of the elegiac, right? The limitations of the sentimental, the limitations of doom and gloom, the limitations of just the pure dour, and how we might take different sidelong ways of imagining towards what many people think is the central political conversation of our time, right? Climate crisis, climate emergency. And how we can, and poetry in general. And there's a million people doing a million exciting things with environmental writing right now. Tom and I have been talking about this a little bit, but basically there could be an argument made that all writing is environmental writing right now, right? Given the current political situation. And tons of people I don't want to undervalue the extent to which I'm inspired every day by different people's astonishing approaches to how we can grapple with questions of how to be a biological / ecological thing in this crazy biological / geological moment. So I'll say that. I hope that addresses your question to some extent, and I'll end it there. Is that sufficient?
Absolutely, it does. Thank you, David. So in conversation yesterday, Leanne Batamasak Simpson discussed the importance of presence or presentness in their novel, Newt Ming, The Cure for White Ladies. And in response to what you said, David, I'm thinking about Kafka's Poseidon, disgruntled manager of the waters, who is so encumbered with continuous calculations and solitary paperwork that he is hardly ever able to visit the sea. And I wonder, Karen, first perhaps, whether you would speak to the way in which you cultivate presence in your daily life, as we're joined by so many in the midst of theirs.
Thanks for that. I want to say, first of all, that Leanne Bettis-Amasaki Simpson is one of my heroes and one of my teachers. I hope she's okay with that. I've read everything she's ever written, and I feel like I have such an indebtedness to writers like her who help me to just make shifts, not entire like reimagining of how we might be in relation with, let's say, the maple sap running. That would be something, but the maple sap running in the urban streets where we live. But I'm paying close attention, and I want to thank her and all the Indigenous writers, whether they're writing fiction or nonfiction or a beautiful hybrid. And Christy Belcourt, I don't know how many of you have seen this astonishing show that I think it's at the McMichael right now. But so one of my answers is, how do I try to apprentice in being more present? One of the answers is by paying close attention and to folks who seem to be able to share the skill of being present, which is an amazing generosity. I can't believe the generosity that comes from folks like that, because they could just say, fuck you, this is too much. We've struggled to be even here, and now we're supposed to be teaching settlers how to be more here. So it's astonishing, and I think I just have the most overflowing gratitude to those folks. Like David said, there's hundreds of thousands, but I really want to I'm just moving off the name of Leanne Bettis-Amasaki Simpson, so not the only one. And if folks know her work, that's great. Find out 2 or 3 more. There's more there. And, reading is something that we do a certain way in this culture. White people have lots of books and read lots. I mean, it's a generalization, but we can learn not just to be insular and solitary, but it can really like force us, push us out of our chairs, push us outside, push us to notice the tree across the street that for some reason we just hadn't noticed up to that point. So the noticing can come from literature. It's not the only place, but I wouldn't be even writing a word down on a page and trying to make it into a book if I didn't have some belief from my own experience of how important literature can be to like give us the push with new eyes and new ears and new tenderness on the bottom of our feet out into the world that we ostensibly inhabit. So that's one of them. I guess the other thing is like the natural world, which is of course everywhere. It's in this room, the spores and the wool breaking down and the angle of the sunlight in November. Every aspect of the world in which we are is astonishing and can capture fully our attentiveness and our like absolute giving over to it showing us something. I was very, very, very lucky in some ways to have grown up. Well, I'm not really grown up, I'm older now, but to have spent a lot of time in like Northern Ontario, which we make jokes about. Like if you're actually from Northern Ontario, it doesn't mean Muskoka, it means like keep driving. So I spent a lot of my childhood in small towns all over Northern Ontario, and small towns in Northern Ontario, the bush is right up against the back fence. And so you can walk out into the bush, and the bush sometimes comes in like moose into the pool, or so the land itself, the bush itself, the waters, ways of being on the water, ways of just walking through the woods, being extremely careful and attentive, because if you didn't, you'd get lost. And so I feel like the being near the trees and in all of that crazy weather and the snow and the snowstorms and the squalls and the ice, and in all the seasons that are so incredibly distinct and bring new challenges about how to pay attention. The seasons were teachers, and I have good eyes and ears for seeing what's there. And it's worth it. It's so worth it. And it's never too late. You know, just start paying attention to fungi right now, and you're going to go down that rabbit hole, and you'll just have a blast, and you'll wonder how you were ever bored, and how you were ever wondering how you're going to get through COVID without losing your mind. One answer is just go outside and look harder, and you're going to see there's a wasp nest hanging in the tree next to you, and oh, there's like a bunch of dead wasps in the gravel that you hadn't noticed before, and oh, if you pick them up, feel how they have an almost weightlessness in your hands. And so it's a long rambling thing, but the natural environment in which we are, which we could be even more in or with, it's the teacher that can astonish us at every turn. And I'm so lucky. I can't even imagine being bored. There's lots of other things. I can be annoyed. I can be like grumpy. I can be argumentative. But I can't even remember for a second the experience of being bored, because I just look out my window and I'd see something that said, hey, come and take a look, or come and listen closer. So I have to thank, Pachamama for being such a crazy great teacher.
David, I wonder if you would share a poem with us. I'm thinking about poetry now as if it has utility, maybe it compels a kind of presence, a kind of waking up to the moment that we're sharing at the moment. And I wonder if you'd facilitate that process by reading a poem called Blades of Grass for us.
Yeah, sure. I accidentally posted in the chat a while back, so I meant to be really slick and queue it up for a future posting. But yeah, instead I was really slick and super blundery, which is very honest, by the way. So welcome to me.
Blundery.
Yeah, and I think that's fascinating. This idea of sort of, as Karen was talking, I was definitely thinking about this question of uselessness and use value in art. And I think precisely what Kevin, you intuited, and what Karen's journey that she's talking about paying attention, right? About slowing down, turning away from your notifications, maybe, or turning away from your calendar or your to-do list, and paying attention to the fungi. I've always said fungi, sorry. And, but thank you as well. And also, just paying attention. I think literature helps us to do that, and literature allows us to slow down, and literature allows us to turn away from the presumption of use, and the presumption of usefulness, and the presumption of instrumentality, in other words, right? So one time, I swear this poem isn't autobiographical at all. It's called Blades of Grass. You can find it if you scroll really high up from the chat.
Been reposted.
Okay, thanks. All the blades of grass were weeping under a side-scrolled Nintendo sky. Oh, ponic dreamscape, peach and rose, palm tree green, synthetic strawberries and bananas, jumping rainbows in galactic fasts. We dropped Wendy's fries on the lawn, and all the grass mouths opened at once, crooning cumulus, howling sodium, lilting chloride. Someone passed a Frosty. My taste buds wailed their single word, saccharin.
David, I'd also like to ask you to say a few words about your work in the prose and poetry of toxic transcendence in the context of fatherhood, which seems to me, in this dim moment we're in together, to be an experience which would require a kind of ferocity of humor and beauty to ensure the well-being, if only temporarily, of one's children. Karen, Tom, you're both parents, to my understanding. And I wonder whether we could look from the perspective of what it means to be a parent in these times for a moment. The three of you, feel free to chime in if you would.
Yeah, well, I've been thinking about it a lot since I read your note, and it's there's a ton that I could say on this. Um, I liked your characterization of this dim moment, Kevin, by the way, because I think, yeah, that just feels very apropos, this idea of the dim. Um, yeah. So, yeah, because I'm skeptical. People talk a lot about this moment, right? And I'm skeptical about our ability to analyze this moment, really. But back to your question about parenting, I have kids. They're 3.5 and 1.5. It's wild. It's insane. I was not ready for it. I don't really recommend it. Except I do, but I recommend proceeding with extreme caution. Nothing has changed me more. I was not ready for it, and it was just totally exhausting. And it was, there was a real darkness to, I'm able to say this because I'm sort of coming out of this a bit with my younger one being 1.5. And I'm sort of, in a weird way, just due to my energy levels, more optimistic than a lot of other people that I talk to, and then I used to be able to conjure, which just suggests interesting things about our own psychological states and our relationship to how we see the external world. Yeah, and so, the obvious thing that I was thinking about when I saw in your notes, to Kevin circulated some notes in advance, and he had some question ideas there. When I saw this one about fatherhood and the relationship between parenting and ecology, I was thinking about just the decision to have children in this world, which was a radical decision, and which was a decision that we did not take lightly. And this comes down to a question about individual choices, right? And the impact our individual choices have, the extent to which we're held responsible as individuals for what's a global catastrophe, right? And we're seeing a lot of climate martyrdom emerge in politics, which is really interesting. So I've seen examples of people who choose not to have children, even though they want children, and sort of go public with this information, and until certain political, certain changes are made in terms of decarbonization efforts and other efforts. And yeah, so I mean, we made this decision. One thing that it does is it forces you to confront forces you to confront your weakness, actually, and how limited, how little you can actually do, right? And we could always do more in the world, and I hope everyone is inspired to do more in the world. And I know other people do a lot of things in the world and activism and whatnot, but yeah, having children just wakes you up in so many ways. And the other thing that I'll say about it is that it's a profoundly biological experience. So on the other side of all this, it just makes you deeply attuned to your body. And I think in that way, it's a very serious moment for ecological thinking. And yeah, it'll certainly change my idea of poetics forever, right? And my idea of poetry and the way that I translate my embodied existence into writing. So that's what I would.
Lovely. Karen or Tom, this question of parenting and this dim moment, if we're going to go with that phrase.
Go ahead, Tom.
Maybe I'll respond, Kevin, with a poem.
Please.
I wrote it the first week of lockdown. It's called The Dates Fell Off. The dates fell off our calendars slowly at first, then like ginkgo leaves after first frost. At the camping store, I bought water filters and bear spray. You asked why. I said, for camping, for bears. You wanted frosted flakes at the grocery store. I caved, we climbed the shelves. The liquor store was long weekend Friday on a Tuesday, people itching in line, running scenarios. We listened to the news in the car. You asked, what is quarantine? Quarantine, I said. That's what I said, you said. What is quarantine? So that's it. That's how I'd answer that question.
I hope our dialogue to this point has been more productive than the exchange contained in that. Karen?
I'll chime in. My kids are now grown up-ish more. I have twins, and they're 31, and each of them now has a child. So I have 2 rambunctious, growing quick grandsons. I've never had boys in my life, so this is already something wonderful and interesting. So they're each 5, 5 and 6. So what came to mind was 2 things. So I'm trying to think about ecology and oikos and house and homing. So the experience of actually being able to have a child, a person, and then we discovered 2 persons growing within your body is probably like the pitch of existential weirdness. Because typically, if your body's changing that fast, like I remember I went from, roughly my 130 pounds to 200 pounds in less than a year. And even that level of physical distortion in that speed usually signals disease or something's not right. And so like having to reconceptualize that things can change wildly fast at a physical level, your hair falls out, it comes back black and curly. All of these like extraordinary takeovers that's happening because other beings are using your body to live and thrive and grow, which turns out to be true of all sorts of other beings in our ears and nose and hair. So I remember having to like really learn quickly how to develop a kind of relaxation that there are other beings living inside me and it wasn't a disease state. And I think that kind of lesson is at this point like largely I'm thinking maybe it's a religious experience in other ways. I don't know. That's not something that I know. But it seems like a lesson that can teach us something beautiful about cohabitation. So that's one thing, that it isn't just a situation of antagonism. There are ways in which we can have mutualistic thrivings and both come out of it sort of fairly well. So that's one lesson, but that was particularly from being pregnant and being like absolutely like trying not to turn a blind eye to any of the weirdness of it. But the other thing I remember is, and this might be true of all parents and however you come to have a child in your arms, which doesn't necessarily have to come out through your body, but a young vulnerable being in your arms. Could be a cat, could be a new puppy, it could be your neighbor's child. But I remember the level of I don't even know what to call it, something like fury and protectiveness. Like it was mountainous intensity of fury and protectiveness and anger that there could be these beings that were so precarious and somehow in my care, and I had no friggin' idea what I was doing and the absurdity of it. And I think what happened inside me was this kind of psychic fury to be like this kind of like a mom, like rise up on my haunches and be furious. And my fury was directed to things like loud trucks and terrible smells in the air that we had to like wheel the pram through, or somebody who hadn't picked up dog shit off the sidewalk, which I might not have noticed before. So you notice on behalf of some other beings who and early on you love them, but you don't know them. And it's just such a strange, strange time. There's also a lesson there that you love something without knowing it. And it's your job to anticipate where it's headed next and be angry at anybody else who's like in a coma and not even caring or noticing. So there's something about that affective fury toward the future, even if it was just like the next step on the sidewalk of these beings, that I think has always stayed with me, and I'm kind of grateful for it. It makes me like extremely politicized, but not just toward other human children. It makes me notice oblivion. It makes me want to elbow obtuseness or lack of caring, lack of giving a shit, and to say, look, my children and their wellness, and your children, it could be worm children and their wellness, and that whatever's going to happen next that's going to be inching toward health and staying alive and thriving and still being here in some kind of beautiful way depends on all of us giving a shit for each other. And the experience of parenting ramped that up in me, and happily, you know, your children do. They head off to daycare, they head off down to gymnastics and waving goodbye to you. They head off, they go away, and then it leaves this space around you where you can either kind of, I think, retract back into your quiet pre-life and take on the projects that were shelved for 20 years, or you can maintain that sense of like giving a shit and find that there are all sorts of other beings who need that level of sort of what would be like a kind of like lend your sense of giving a shit to so many other beings and things. And if we could do that even in like caring about littering on our driveway, just in the spaces where we are, thank goodness. Like what else will keep that intensity of caring for others that are near us and whose lives are unfolding around us? What else could do it? And so parenting is a real trip. It's really horrible. It's really awful. It's fantastic. But that's one of the things, is it puts some kind of roar in me and helps that to stay happening. I'm grateful. It's not everybody's experience, but it was my experience, and I'm very grateful.
David, I think you had a response for a question asked by Roy that was related to poesis in relation to techno, modes of human making. I'm looking at a relevant term on the back of Humanimus, human animal sheen. Okay, I gaffed that 3 times, but I'll leave it with you, David, to improve.
Okay, as long as we segue back to Karen reading some poems for us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I see people are leaving. I'm like, oh, don't go yet.
Should we come back to that one, Kevin, and have Karen?
I'm happy to move on, yeah.
Your questions
Karen, you've got
fantastic.
Maybe Karen wants to pick up the question, yeah, and I'd love to.
Honestly, I wasn't listening because I was thinking about dog shit.
Hunter-gatherer.
Ah. Okay, so I'm going to, I hope this is loud enough. I did put a little sticky note. I don't think I've read this poem out loud, so I'm very, very happy about that. I'm going to just add a few remarks to orient, if that's helpful. So when I was working on this book, among other sources that I sort of randomly dug through random archives that had information or insight about the different layers of histories that were in this site. Some of them were archaeological. I was reading the archaeological papers of Ontario, the Ontario Archaeological Society. And one of the things that I learned that I wouldn't have known before is that archaeological sites are often, what's the word? Like when there's a site that's discovered and archaeologists go into the site, they try to protect the site from theft. And so sort of it can be a secret, but often it's the case that the archaeologists steal the artifacts because they have a kind of privileged access to that. So, and there's a lot of lawsuits around archaeologists, you know, so-called fine upstanding individuals. There was one with an archaeologist from Western, and this particular site I'm talking about has to do with an archaeologist who was found guilty of stealing from the very site that he had said to be like having this authority. So that site is called the Freelton site. And Freelton's just a little town south of Guelph. If you're driving from Guelph straight down to Hamilton, you're going to cross very, very close between the lakes area, and Freelton's a tiny a tiny town there. And the only reason I ever went to Freelton is there's like a weird, fabulous flea market there. And I really love flea markets. So it's partly about the flea market, but what's flea market but a kind of odd kitchen drawer of the last 500 years of stuff that's there. And it's full of characters, if you can say the least. So I guess that's it. I was also thinking a lot about, okay, so you're going to hear about glass beads, and these are the things that were actually traded. And some of the information also, the facts of the matter of Freelton come from also the Jesuit and the Allied relations, the texts, the incredible texts that were sent back to France by the Jesuits who were in this area, what's called the area of Huronia, between the time when the Jesuits were first coming onto these shores, which I don't know, probably 1580 and a bit later. But there's a whole sequence of letters that were, I guess, obliged by the Jesuits to send back to France after they had literally canoed on the waters from Quebec City and what is Montreal inland, and portage from Mattawa across Nipissing to the French River, come down the Georgian Bay through the Maitland into, it's just incredible. And the Jesuits were in this area from 1610 through to about 1690. So they were kind of witnesses to Indigenous histories in this place. And there's a lot more you could say about that. But the Jesuit and the Allied relations are an incredible, source of observations about that time. So lots of this comes from the Jesuit and the Allied relations. Here we go. This one is called Hunter-Gatherer. And the epigram, objects have mass, which is not so much weight as it is the resistance to being moved around in the universe. Lake Erie to Lake Ontario's diagonal slide is the north-south number 6. At its midpoint, the Freelton Flea Market sits on a rutted dirt bump. Treasure hunters, walking with their eyes, meander this double-decker, no-heat emporium of extra weird floor-to-ceiling accumulation of lifetime of companions, bought or sold. Relics of delight, estate auction spores, boxed lots, go for broke end-of-season bidding wars, what was handed down, what the barrister doled out among the siblings, what a rained-out garage sale abandoned at curbside gets you. A headlamp, a metal detector, a black cassock button with an iron eye, every axe gone missing, shoveling, stolen, lifted, as we like to say. The Freelton site, Borden number HAIHA-14, approximately 1.25 hectares in size. West Flamborough Township, Regional Municipality of Hamilton, Wentworth, see Figure 1. The Attawandaron Nation once lived exactly there, the village of Kiowatea, 1712. Large enough for the Jesuits to have visited on their fishing expedition into the deep pockets of Huronia, coughing up one bead after another. Trolling for converts, they bagged a windfall of Wenro refugees from upstate New York. And the deal goes down, quick wrist. A trinket into one hand, some money out the other, and the wallet flick, jackknifing halfway to baptismal spirit slots where convulsions are hiding like eels. And Peter and Paul and a few of the weekend sportsmen are casting in the upstream shallows for carp and suckers, and the quick release arcing out over the spinning spool, pretending it's not buying, it's just looking. And the painted turtle rattle climbs up the fish ladder, which assists salmon in migrating upstream. And the forged hook drops deep into a quieted pool. Of course, a new feature not found in the original dam. Maybe they still all live there, in the Freelton store, awaiting their residency papers, or change from a 20, or further direction from the Jesuits. Maybe the women are growing corn, beans, squash, having rigged up mirrors and garden hoses, and are now pounding their three sisters with chunks of white-tailed deer and passenger pigeons, feeding an entire nation with their fingers. Maybe the femur bones of the large mammals and the wishbones of the shorebirds and the gnawed cobs in the fire are the next big ash pocket of carbonized remains, out of which a new inventory of what plants had been eaten today will eventually be able to be conducted with some compensations. Passing the time napping Onondaga chert into point, stone chips flying at the windshields in the parking lot, leaving a telltale circle in the soil at their feet, which looters and archaeologists and dealers will someday pick out like a hawk. Burned elements, butchering marks, animal gnaw marks, evidence of hunting in the form of a projectile tip found embedded in the distal half of a deer right radius. A type IC22 tubular glass red bead. A good deal placed in the hand to consider. In good faith, all objects go to the hand. The hand of the vendor, so nicotined with cash he won't meet our eye. For the price of one saved soul, he'll throw in the pair. Even undifferentiated metal artifacts harbor a power to return us to the place of their making. Even undifferentiated metal artifacts harbor a power to return us to the place of their making. The hand of the first maker lives there too, inside things, the hand in its first mode of considering.
A question came through as you were reading that extraordinary poem, Karen. Do you think of landscapes or rivers as archives? I'm thinking about this line, even undifferentiated metal artifacts harbor a power to return us to the place of their making. Do you think of yourself as a poet archivist? I mean, what?
Well, a kind of crazed archivist, an archivist that probably will be kicked out of archive job life because there's the expectation that the archivist makes choices about a kind of purity of a line that he or she will follow. We'll only read these, we'll only look at rocks. We're not going to look at the trees next to the rocks. We're only going to look at these rocks. We're only going to pick up metal artifacts. The glass ones are of no interest to us. We're going to open the first drawer, not the second drawer. The second drawer is for wampum. The first drawer is for powwow. We're just interested in powwow. So archiving is a kind of sorting, and we have a great capacity for sorting. And I'm really interested in the unsorted and undifferentiated, and what happens when you read an archive this way rather than this way. So largely the book is a kind of frenzied midden where the archives are mixed up. And I have to say that I learned this technique probably from two places. One is from garbage dumps. So if you have never visited a big urban garbage dump, you'll get taught a lot there about how unruly the artifacts actually can behave once they've been tossed together in their final resting place. I spent a whole day in La Chesnée outside of Montreal, which receives all the crap from the city of Montreal, but also in a more academic sense from critical theorists. And I'm from Michel Foucault, who performed these weirdo archival readings of 100-year history, a slice about prison reform, the rise of mental institutions. And what he did there is he tried to notice his own propensity to order things, select things, leave certain things to the side while he was building this crazy archive, and then say, let's look at our habits of ordering while I'm doing this ordering, so that we can learn something about how it is that we think and see and create a world. So those are sort of two sources. One that's got its material power, another that's a critical exercise in noticing how we order.
I wonder, Tom, if you might say something here with regard to the Antler River Rally and the way in which the river, to return to that as we were discussing it earlier, is a repository of the unsorted. It's sort of at the periphery of a sorted, organized, structurally contiguous, urban sort of environment. And then there are things that are sort of refused and pushed to the periphery, and they often end up in the river, either objects with or without animus. Depending on one's perspective, I suppose. There are humans there, there's no question. I mean,
yeah.
Kevin, your questions. Yeah, thinking about objects, and yeah, I spent a lot of time with garbage, you know, and I spent a lot of time with garbage, and I think about its making, and how we put these objects. Maybe this will dovetail and move quickly to what David, the question that David was going to answer, but about our making of these objects that we put into the world that will outlive us by thousands of years. And I think about that every time we're down at the river, kind of, you know, picking up this garbage, especially in the way that we go down to the river, and the river conveys so many things. It conveys a lot of garbage, and we go to the same spots month after month, year after year now, almost a decade, and picking up the same, obviously different, you know, but copies of these same cups, same plastic bits, same things. And I think about their origin, where they came from, how they got to me there, and what it sounds, this is an unfleshed out thought, or a kind of half-baked thought, but my responsibility to those objects, and to the peoples whose hands they've passed through. I think it's too easy to think of garbage as just, you know, as abject, or something just to be kind of thrown away. I think the care and compassion, or the care and the paying attention to the nature that we've been talking about, is also something we have to pay attention to, these objects that we've placed in this world, and where they will end up, and what their stories are, and how they interact, how the six-pack ring interacts with becomes a part of the ecology of the river. As much as we pull these things out of the river, we also do it recognizing we're just pulling them out and sending them off to another space, a space that is also, you know, part of the ecology, also, you know, in many instances, part of a kind of, you know, environmental racism. Where do landfill sites end up? You know, and what are we doing this for, and for whom, and all these kinds of, David uses the term entanglements to talk about nature writing, and I really like that term, entanglements. Yeah, and so when we, you know, I guess when we first started the work, I thought, well, let's go down to the river and clean it up, you know, and make it look nice again, and save the turtles. And you know, the spiny soft-shelled turtle is an endangered turtle. All Ontario turtles are endangered. So that is part of the work, and it's important. But it also, that kind of, you know, that environmentalism isn't straightforward. It has its own histories, its own kind of complex kind of, it's interwoven with white supremacy and all of these kinds of questions. And so I think when we go down to the river and we kind of are under bridges, and we're kind of, you know, dealing with garbage, and we're also, you know, dealing with the lives of people who sometimes are living rough along the river, and whose lives are exposed for everyone to see. And, you know, and so to put it this way, you know, our garbage is, picked up, we put it out at night, we put it out at night, and in the morning it's magically disappeared, right? And some people who are living rough on the river in London, who are experiencing homelessness, they live their lives out in the open for everyone to kind of, judge and so often their objects and the things that they have are the things that we have like dumped in secondhand stores or thrift shops. And I think about those relationships of how we treat things like trash, we treat people like they're throwaway. And so all that work is down there. This is a very muddled answer to your question, Kevin, but those are some of the things that, that I think about when I think about what the river carries.
It's a muddled subject and an excellent answer, Tom. I've got two more questions. We're going to wrap in about 10 minutes. The first one's for David. Speaking of the question of the extent to which we're commingled with objects, or entangled, if you prefer. David, you've written a tremendous book, Humanimus, and on the back of it is the word humanimal sheen. And I think that this relates to an earlier question that Roy put to you through the chat. I wonder if you might respond to that. I didn't mean for that.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, humanimal sheen. That's not my word. That's Dominic Petman's word. And he's a fantastic theorist about animals, about media, about ecology, about posthumanism. He's about the history of cybernetics. He's a very capacious thinker, very productive as well. So yeah, I sort of borrowed that idea, or I should say it was influential to me in my writing of this. My title, Humanimus, obviously has some similarities with his idea of the humanimal machine, but you can see the prominence of the machine there in humanimal machine. So yeah, I can segue this back to Roy's question about techne, and Roy said sort of the poetics of ecology, he thinks of techne. Maybe we can go back to, maybe I can go back to the exact words of Roy's question so that I can attempt to do it some justice. But so this question of techne, I can't actually, I'm not capable. So if someone else is able to help me. Oh, here we go. Yeah. I'm interested in poesis in relation to techno, modes of human making. Right now I'm reading the Reindeer Chronicles and attempting about attending, listening to what bad nature, right? Depleted nature so far is reanimated by imitating what it does and doing unto it what it does when we undo what we did, techno. Okay, so I'm fascinated by that. I can't speak to the Reindeer Chronicles. That's not a book I'm familiar with, but I'm fascinated. Sounds fascinating. I really like this idea of bad nature. Nicole Seymour wrote a book a few years ago called Bad Environmentalism. And that ties into some of the stuff I was saying earlier about sort of the pious, appropriate ways to approach ecological thinking, and the ways that some of those ways of approaching ecological thinking can be and are being reanimated sort of out of necessity, I think, and out of formal exhaustion and emotional exhaustion. And one of the things I was thinking about when Tom was talking about garbage, very poetically, is just our emotional relationship to these objects as well. And the way that there's a human history in every piece of trash. There's a certain, whether it's a throwaway history or not, right? There's an emotional history in every single one of those objects that ends up in Thames River, right? And thinking about the future of this techne, this thrown away technology, this petroleum byproduct for the most part, right? Is itself, I think, a profound poetic gesture. Right, thinking about the lifespan of an N95 mask, right, I think is a profound poetic gesture, and suggests a sort of imaginative exercise that is what is the type of thing that a poetics of ecology can give us, among many, many, many other things. I remember, and tying us back again to this question of the archive, there's this book called Lost in the Archive, that was pretty interesting to me a little while ago. And one piece of that book is a collection of essays by different authors. And one of the authors had examined this question of proper signage for things for dangerous sites, such as nuclear reactors that would outlive that would in all likelihood outlive the human species, right? So like what appropriate signage to put around Chernobyl on the off chance that if future intelligent life encounters Chernobyl 25,000 years from now, right? And yeah, to me, that's just, you can see me smiling and getting enthusiastic about this, right? Because it's totally horrific to think, and yet totally there's something there that compels my imagination. And so I do, I'm thinking along these lines a lot of the time in Humanimus. One of the things that I often think about is the biology of technology, right? So again, we like to think of technology as inert, as something that, and Karen was actually alluding to this when she spoke about the spores in this room, right? So we think of technology as inert, but in fact, like I mentioned, petroleum derived. If it's derived from petroleum, that means it's originally derived from animal and vegetal bodies, which is one of the things, oil, right? Petroleum is one of the things I'm really interested in this book. I have a whole section on oil. So yeah, that gives us a really good example of the human-animal scheme, right? Where mechanics, technology, human bodies, animal bodies mix and mingle together. And that's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And my last word on this is simply that language is itself, of course, a technology, right? And at the same time, an organism, an animal, right? So language gives us a thing that has a life of its own, right? I would say, an agency and an animacy. That's all I'll say about that for now.
So the final question, Karen, we're all of us in rooms surrounded by spores of technology, as well as ideological spores in the form of, white, cisgendered, ecocidal, suffragicidal patriarchy. And on that note, I was wondering whether you would say a few words about why you dedicated this extraordinary collection to your sisters, to all our sisters, human and other.
I wasn't expecting that. So my answers always have like at least two prongs. And on the human prong, I do have two biological sisters, and I have two stepsisters. So the biological sisters, one is named Shelley, she's older than I am, and one is named Lisa, and she's younger than I am. I have learned from strange experiences. I mean, there's something being shown to us about witnessing when you realize that you've spent all of your life not necessarily alone, that there's been somebody else in the room with you. Maybe you didn't notice they were in the room with you. I have lots of interesting memories where I had no idea that my sister also was seeing the same thing. And it wasn't until we were older and could compare notes, sometimes it would just be random, and that I had no recollection that I had a companion. And so siblings who've been around for a long time, I was thinking about the two-row wampum. It's such a beautiful metaphor for difference that travels alongside one another. And I think in the best possible experience, I'm 55 now, and I think, you've been with me all along. And the same is true of, parents. The same is true to a degree of objects. I have a little horse that my friend gave me in kindergarten that's been with me a long time. But the activeness of the siblings and the way that they can bear witness to the worlds that you've been in together, and in my case, it turns out to be sisters. So that's part of that. I've really come to see the uniqueness of that and what you can learn from realizing that you were not alone the whole time and how that feels. So that's from a human perspective. But I'm not a humanist anymore. I might have been, but I'm like absolutely not a humanist philosopher. I'm some kind of a-humanist or pan-post-humanist. And so I have a genuine sense that's not fabricated, that the beings that I've collected are sisters, and they have a relationship of sort of bearing witness and being alongside and giving rise to other things and nourishing and weaving into the world a kind of feminine dimension that is important and unique. So there's that. I do think about the rivers as in some way sisters. I don't know exactly how that is. Sort of uncanny sensitivities sometimes to one another. The weird thing about being female, there's lots of weird things about being female, but one of them is like the eggs with which you were born contain the, future beings in which, if they're female, contain the eggs of the future females. And we don't have to talk about humans anymore. We can talk about salmon spawn and how important it is to pay attention to those long forward strings of fecundity, and that they're carried in the bodies of females. So I think that that's what I mean when I say to all of our sisters. Yeah.
Karen, I'd like to put you a little bit on the spot here. Getting the wrap it up sign here from the artistic director, Josh Lambier, for whom I'm deeply grateful for this opportunity. But I wonder whether, lest we conclude with talk, whether you'd read another poem. I'm thinking namely Roma.
Oh, only if you let me cry.
Please. We can together.
Roma. I'm glad that Tom mentioned the folks sleeping rough, because those folks appear here too. But this isn't a poem just about people. It's not a poem not about people and certain peoples, the gypsies, the Romas, the marginals, the ones who are not quite wanted, the ones waiting for their papers. It's about them, but it's also about, I guess, vulnerable beings, not wanted, whoever those turn out to be. At this point, it's the emerald ash borer. It's a certain kind of foam that's used in automobile seats that doesn't break down. Those plastic 6-pack things, those are, we can make a list of the unwanteds. And so this is kind of a poem about being confronted by the unwanteds and my strange, I think it's actually a compunction to try to help or save. So I'm thinking about Tom going to the river to help the river, and these are hard-won Judeo-Christian gestures, and they're both good and not good. So it was just me noticing that. So this is both about the Romas in the sense of the peoples as a kind of a stand-in, a code for the unwanteds, but it's also the name of a kind of tomato, which most of us have put in our bodies. All right. Roma. Up the gravel track from Springbank Farm, the tomatoes in the community garden sag and shine equally, heavy after a big lunch of summer. They watch the leaves of North Dumfries turn color till the ball diamond at Ebycrest Park lights up. Then they turn in for the night. Midnight of the autumn solstice, cloud hands slip around the moon's watchful face. Covering her eyes and mouth in one fluid motion, the fog blade slides from its hiding place in the buckthorn hedgerow and, as it is written, lays waste. At dawn, snuffed out candle smoke spirals up from the fruiting bodies, stock stiff in the mud on either side of the quake boards. The Roma stand together in a fatalized field, staring outwards. Their lace green skirts are charred at the edges, curling up. At their feet, a perfect ring, a clutch of cold, red eggs, silent as the story she won't speak anymore. Down the hill from the slaughter, the hen house awakes. Hands reach underneath female fluff for everyday miracles. Everyday miracles are revealed. They are in the dented straw, shaped like a mother's body, warm and edible. Even the plainest hen will gather herself and step and step out a stamp-sized door onto grass chalked with hoarfrost. The vegetable mothers, though, the ones who sleep rough in the open field, their eggs are stone cold. Most have split open in the head from the high drop out of her arms. Others show bruises where Jack Frost pressed his thumbs into the fontanelle until the pink pulse of flesh stopped flickering at the edge. Those ones look like tiny unborn lepers. A hypothermic injection into plump veins all at once, an entire family goes black and slack. The ones that look like they're only sleeping, they're not sleeping. They've already been entered from the dirt side by earwigs and gluey slugs. Black slivers of wriggling tubes are sucking the sweet flesh into their own horrible little adventitious bodies. At first light, I find myself walking up and down the rows of the badly marred and the newly dead. I find myself gathering them up in dainty salvage, bulging my hoodie pouch. By the time I cross the farmhouse lintel, more have died and bled right through to my stomach skin. At the kitchen sink, with her old hooked knife, I pare away the surface damage, the canker rot, then drown what's left to drown, the marmorated stink bugs and the slugs hiding out in the good parts. I make plain tomato sauce, salsa di pomodori. We eat it for dinner that same night, on pasta with nothing but fresh ground pepper.
Karen Houle, author of The Grand River Watershed of Folk Ecology. David Huebert, author of Humanimus. Tom Cull, author of Bad Animals. Thank you three for this conversation. And thank you for allowing poetry its utility, namely to wake us up to this moment we're in together.
Thanks all.
Mm-hmm.